Good afternoon. My name is Jose Diaz, Chief Curator at the Andy Warhol Museum. Thank you for joining us for Art in Context, Reconstructing Monuments, featuring Kambui Olujimi, Tereneh Idia, Bekezela Mguni, Dr. Patricia Eunji Kim, and Dr. Alaina Roberts. Art in Context is a series that draws on Andy Warhol's life, work, and legacy as a starting point to open up conversations about complex contemporary issues. This program aims to spark relevant discourse and forge new connections between artists, scholars, and our audience. Today's program is inspired by our current exhibition, Fantasy America, which invites New York-based artists Nona Faustine, Kambui Olujimi, Pacifico Solano, Nama Sabar, and Chloe Weiss to revisit Andy Warhol's 1985 publication, America, and contribute through their own artistic practices. The works in this exhibition probe and challenge the perceptions of what America is and what it can become. Like Warhol, the artists in this exhibition hold a mirror to society, reflecting the country at a critical juncture in history. I am honored to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Alaina Roberts. Dr. Roberts is an award-winning historian who studies the intersection of Black and Native American life from the Civil War to the modern day. She is currently an assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Roberts holds a doctorate in history from Indiana University and a Bachelor of Arts in History with honors from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She writes, teaches, and presents public talks about Black and Native history in the West, family history, slavery in the Five Tribes, Native American enrollment politics, indigeneity in North America and across the globe, Black and Native American portrayals in the media, and identity. Her first book, I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on the Native Land, is now available for purchase in bookstores and online. I loved it and I really recommend it. In addition to multiple academic articles, Dr. Roberts' writing has appeared in news outlets like the Washington Post, High Country News, and Time Magazine, and she's been profiled by CNN, Smithsonian Magazine, and the Boston Globe. I would like to thank Danielle Linzer and the team at the Warhol, as well as our sponsors for making this program possible. Thank you all for joining, and please check out warhol.org for additional programming and upcoming exhibitions. Now I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Roberts.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you all for being here today. So as a historian, as a human being, as a person of color, I have watched 2019, 2020, 2021 come, and the discussions around museums, public history, monuments has been really amazing because a lot of people have kind of learned about what historians have been talking about for a long time, but also learned about people on the ground in various places around the country who have been advocating for a long time for change in various ways, some to remove monuments and to put others up, some to remove monuments and to not replace them. And so a lot of these kind of conversations that have been in the atmosphere, one could say, are going to be the topic of our conversation today. And I think as a historian, reading about what people kind of write from the academic perspective is of course interesting, but hearing what artists have to say is also kind of illuminating in a different way, because artists allow us to think about monuments, think about public history in a kind of different way that gets to really the sentiment behind these objects, and not just kind of in a kind of academic way, but also in a visceral way, which is the way we as humans respond to things. And so today I'm going to first introduce you to the panelists and allow them to introduce themselves, and then also kind of take you on a journey where we discuss multiple things in both kind of academic and artistic ways. And so I'm first going to give the mic, so to speak, to Dr. Kim.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here to participate in this virtual conversation. I want to first thank Danielle, Jose, and everyone at the Warhol Museum for organizing it. My name is Trisha Kim, and I am trained as an art historian and an archaeologist, and I come to this conversation with that background. I'm also a curator and editor at Monument Lab, which is a public art and history studio based out of Philadelphia. I'm thrilled to be in dialogue with this brilliant group of thinkers to address this question around how or if public memorials and monuments might be vehicles for a more just future. In other words, what kinds of interventions do we need with regard to our public memorials? So at Monument Lab, we define a monument quite broadly as a statement of power and presence in public, which means that symbols and systems of power are really intricately intertwined. Memorials and monuments serve as memory aids that create physical spaces for people to affirm specific narratives of what happened and who was there. Moreover, and perhaps most urgently, monuments can be sites where power dynamics are expressed, contested, and even resisted. Next slide, please. So public art raises questions around whose stories are worth remembering and which values and ideas need to be memorized and internalized. Or to follow and learn from the Haitian anthropologist Michel Rouve-Trouillot, quote, any historical narrative is a particular bundle of silences, the result of a unique process, and the operation required to deconstruct these silences will vary accordingly. Such silences and absences speak loudly about which voices and bodies do and do not matter to America. Our histories, even those from the deep past, are not far removed from our present after all. Rather, they persist through our monuments, or they try to, and through us. Next slide, please. Trouillot's understanding of history closely resonates with the idea that there's no such thing as neutrality, especially as it regards the monument landscape. Though monuments seem static, they are in fact not. Instead, they possess a corporeal substance to them, aliveness. Because of this, they're always incomplete, especially since people will continue to assign different meanings to them. And despite the ways that conventional monuments convey a sense of permanence through their materials or colossal scale, they depend heavily on maintenance and care in order to exist into the future. Next slide, please. This maintenance work is expensive. In December 2018, a special report was published by the Smithsonian Magazine and the investigative fund at the Nation Institute. And that report found that over the past decade, at least 40 million taxpayer dollars were directed to preserving Confederate heritage, including statues, homes, parks, museums, libraries, cemeteries, and so on. And the Equal Justice Initiative has a really interesting kind of compilation of different state budgets and how they invest their public funds to sort of upkeep Confederate heritage. Next slide, please. So what can we do to ensure that monuments and heritage sites bring about a just future? So sure, toppling, removing, renaming monuments that communities deem problematic, and even imagining more inclusive monuments may be some worthwhile strategies. But I want the audience to know that despite the $40 million price tag attached to the preservation of Confederate heritage, it's a fact that the costs of preservation, removal, and construction are far less than, say, reforming education, healthcare, law enforcement, environmental policy, and housing. I mean, 40 million is a big number, but what ensures justice in communities, I think, costs far more. Nevertheless, I still think that monuments are a valuable and critical place to start, not least for their corporeality and meaningfulness. The most recent changes to the nation's monument landscape spark critical conversations, they connect people, and most importantly, they tell the truth. Monumental interventions reveal in spectacular fashion the willingness of people to tell the truth about our histories and ourselves, the first of many steps toward transforming the worlds and systems that we've inherited. And I look forward to the conversation that follows everyone's presentations. Thank you for your time.
Hello, everyone. I am Tereneh Idia, and I'm a designer and an artist. I have one slide to share with you, just some of the work that I do. And the top left is work from Idia Dega, which is a eco-design collaboration with myself and Maasai women from the Lugazali community in Kenya, as well as artisans from the Oneida Indian Nation of New York. I also am a writer. I write for the Pittsburgh City paper. I'm a columnist, and I spend a lot of time writing about social justice issues, centering Black women's voices, as well as other women and other people of the global majority, which is a term I use rather than people of color or minority. And then to the far right is an image from a apparel line that I started that kind of represents Pittsburgh as a sports town, but centering artists and animals and neighborhoods. So I created a fictionalized sports team that celebrates the animals with attitudes called AAA Animals, and commissioned artists to create these designs for these fictional teams. Really just to kind of think about how can we look beyond the human family and how can we redefine Pittsburgh in a way that celebrates other things besides the things we often celebrate. And then the last thing that I'll point out is a collaboration that I work on called Other Border Wall. We started in 2017 as a protest submission to the then President Trump's border wall project. We actually submitted art walls or no walls directly to the RFQ. As a way of kind of saying, we don't believe in borders, we don't believe in barriers, we don't believe in these definitions of what nationhood and citizenship is. And so we are protesting that by making a submission of art. So my work in general is a way of thinking about things and centering people that are not silent, but silenced, but are essential and critical to both the past, present, and future of Pittsburgh, which is where I focus on my work. Thank you for your time, and I'm really excited about this conversation.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Bekezela Mguni. I'm really glad to be here with you all. I'm an artist and a librarian and a community archivist and a learner. And so I'm grateful to be in this space to learn with you all as well. I share this piece. This is a piece I created in 2015 in honor of Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy and the Grand Midwives. This piece is a screen print that has been in a few different spaces, but one of the most recent spaces I had the fortune, Tereneh invited us to be a part of her show Constellations, and it was placed downtown Pittsburgh and enlarged for community to see. But it is in honor of the legacy of Black women who were midwives in this country, and also of Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, who are three of the enslaved Black women whose names we know, who were operated on by J. Marion Sims, who is known as the father of gynecology. And I wanted to, in my artwork, one of the ways that I feel that I have power, one, to engage with my ancestors and with my legacy, as well as to challenge narratives, is to create something new and something, to create something that lifts up a legacy that is often repressed or omitted from the histories that we are taught. So there are statues of J. Marion Sims around the country, and there have been a lot of efforts to remove them and to bring light to the atrocities that he committed. And this print was my opportunity to create a time travel piece. One of the things that was important to me was for Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy to receive care and tenderness. And in this piece, they meet midwives from the 1930s, South Florida. And those women are actually the mothers of reproductive justice, the mothers of gynecology, the mothers of care for this country. And so, you know, it's important for us to be able to take back our narratives and lift up the truth of the stories that we've been told. So I wanted to share this piece as an example of the work that I do creatively, to redefine and retell the stories that, and the lies, honestly, that we've been told. I'll go to the next slide. I'm a part of the Black Unicorn Library, which is a community-based library and archive project. We believe in the possibilities of libraries and the possibility of people learning together and sharing their knowledge with one another. And we pop up in various spaces in our community. And this is an example of us at the farmers market in Lawrenceville. We celebrate the writing of Black women, LGBTQ people, and the canon of literature that Black folks across the diaspora have created. And specifically, Black people were forbidden to become literate in this country, and we were the only group that that was specifically designated for. And so our work is about celebrating that and uplifting the stories that transform the world and offer us a liberatory path forward. And I'll move to the next slide. Similarly to the first piece, this is a piece honoring Maud Kalin, who was a nurse midwife in South Carolina, and really, once again, just lifting up a narrative that is often forgotten and not given the space that, you know, monuments to someone like J. Marion Sims has had. Move forward to the next slide, excuse me. Thank you. This is an image of Flowers for Black Girls. One of the things that's important for us in Pittsburgh is really to challenge the narratives that are told about Black women and girls and femmes and people of marginalized genders. And there's a lot of statistics out there that speak about Pittsburgh being, you know, deemed the most livable city. But we know that to be a mixed report. And in fact, for people who identify as women and girls and people who are trans and non-binary, and gender nonconforming, we know that we face many challenges living in the city of Pittsburgh. And at the same time as we face those challenges, we create much of the beauty that Pittsburgh is known for and is celebrated for. And so Flowers for Black Girls came out of the loss of a community member, a 16-year-old Tiara Whitehead, who was found in a park in Pittsburgh. And we wanted to extend care to her story because she wasn't treated with much care in the news. And she was, you know, her life was treated as another passing headline. And so this was an act of creative resistance on her birthday in October in 2014. And we shared over 500 flowers with Black women and girls to uplift their lives. And we've continued that program over the last several years. And last year during the pandemic, we really had an opportunity to lift up the lives, the work, and affirm Black women and girls and people of marginalized genders. And this is just one of the ways that we are creating an archive of care, because instead of having a continued lack of the uplift of Black women, I want to see examples of where we have cared for one another, where we've lifted each other up. And I know that work happens because it's because of Black women that we've survived. And so this is an example of some of the work that we do. And thank you all for listening.
How you doing? I'm going to share with you 3 projects and 3 strategies that happen in terms of where I intersect with monuments and memoriam. This is a piece called Fishing for Wishes, which is a wish hall of fame in Queens. And so you can go to the next slide and you can just let them roll every like 10 seconds. It's taking a thing that is ephemeral and sort of making it permanent, and that permanence then falls under question. Like the idea that you can hold a wish, and these are some of the wishes that I've made over the course of my life at the time, engraved in brass. And thinking of some of the rituals that we carry every day is something as simple as transforming a penny into a wish and then throwing it into this, you know, sea of like a manufactured sea. There's a way in which we constantly update. So something that Dr. Kim brought up was the permanence or the atemporal, this idea that these ideas and these people are fixed in time, and those ideals are fixed in time. You can go to the next slide. You can just do every like 10 seconds. This is a body of work also where it's called solastalgia. And one of the things I was thinking about here is how it is so important to craft our own narrative, to memorialize those intersections with, I want to say, with greatness that we cross every day. Those people. This is for my guardian angel, a woman named Catherine Arline. And the idea that we have a space where we make these vitrines and again interrogate this process of ritual as monument versus a singular gesture that should be fixed in time. This is a work that is comprised of furniture from Miss Arline's house, as well as hand sculpted glass pieces and part of our corporal detritus, such as hair or sand. I think about how sand constantly, it is the wearing of time. To show up at a beach, you see the wearing of the earth over millennia, over epoch. Next slide. Again, for me, when we think about a memorial, what's the point of intersection? And that's something that comes up for me over and over again. So a piece like "I Knew You Before You Was Born" is really important because there are relationships that I feel like that we start our lives already engaged in. And to me, it's one of the most beautiful things about family and about neighborhood and about community, is that you show up to a place and everyone they already know you, they already know about you, or there's also a place that they have been reserving for you for some time. And so when we talk about remembering a memorial, that's another sort of turning the heroic monument doesn't make space for this kind of continuum or relationship to time. One of the histories that I was interested in is how white supremacy and the myth of whiteness sort of shakes off the legacy of violence. And so in this piece, go to the next slide, it's called Redshift, and it's a series of would-be or successful presidential assassins. And all of the assassins are white Americans. And so this notion, this was made during a past presidency, but it galvanized this idea that the threat is always the other. The threat is always coming from some foreign entity, when in fact there's a legacy of violence embedded in white supremacy that has been here and is akin and sort of braided in with white privilege. And so this class of assassins were those ink paintings were placed upon the installation of the alt-right protests in Charlottesville. And I think that ultimately talks about both this access to privilege and power, as well as a kind of consummate amnesia that goes on in the construction of whiteness.
Well, thank you all so much for those introductions to your thought-provoking work. We will definitely focus more on the ideas that you brought up about monuments, but Kambui gives me a great kind of transition into a foundational question for the panel, and that's, what is a monument? I mean, Kambui has kind of given us the idea that it is not, of course, just like a statue. It can be many things. It can represent many things, and also the ideas behind it can be either, memorializing a specific moment in time or crystallizing a new interpretation of history. That was often kind of the context for Confederate memorials. They were created in often the 20th century, going into the 1950s, 60s, 70s. So this is not kind of like right after the Civil War, as I think a lot of people initially believe. So for the panel, can you kind of just give us an idea of what you think of as a monument, what you think of as the human attraction to creating some kind of permanent public history that represents a thought or a feeling or sentiment?
I think a lot about this, being surrounded by public art and monuments. And I think they play similar roles in that you are trying to create a narrative of what is valued and what is important and what's worth celebrating, as well as trying to tell a history and even shape the future, right? Because you're trying to mark human achievement and human achievement worth celebrating. And then trying also to create kind of the model for the way that we should live our lives. So it's really, when Dr. Kim was talking about the monuments being corporeal and alive, that's the first time I actually kind of clicked, like my little brain, like, yes, exactly, because you have a reaction to it, but you also have conversations with these monuments, right? You have a relationship with these monuments. So it really is something that is like this live neighbor making sounds all the time and telling stories all the time. In a place like Pittsburgh, which has monuments that are very specific to white men, to war, to soldiers, and all these things, that the hero monuments, as Kambui said, it lets you know whether you're welcomed or celebrated or not. Do I exist in the public sphere? Do I exist in the public realm? Does representations of me and my achievements and my ancestors, are they represented here? If so, how? If not, how or why?
I'd like to pick up on what Tereneh just said. What I love about Monument Lab's sort of official, unofficial, or unofficial, official definition of a monument is that it's so broad and it allows us to kind of think about monuments more expansively while sort of explaining why monuments are so important to communities of people. I personally would say that a monument is whatever a community of people decides is a monument, is their monument. I think that according to Philly-based poet and artist Ursula Rucker, we are our own monuments, pointing to in sort of the ways in which communities survive through time. And that is a testament of sort of staying power, so to speak. And I think what's interesting is that the public eye has really focused their energies toward sanctioned monuments or conventional monuments. So Kambui said heroic monuments, so things that try to convey a sense of permanence and just eat up all of our taxpayer dollars because they are so expensive to take care of. But I really cannot emphasize enough that monuments really come in all shapes and sizes, at least in our research and work that we've done at Monument Lab. Murals, right? In the past year, I think Black Lives inspired murals have popped up in cities and towns in 28 states and 3 countries. So that just goes to show how monument landscapes and sort of aesthetic trends shift through time. But I think that's what's so exciting about this particular area of conversation and study and visual production is that it can really be anything. And then I want to co-sign what Kambui said about ritual processes as sort of the zone or the area and space in which the monument actually starts to take form. I'll stop there.
Thank you all. I totally agree with you. And I feel like for me and the work that we're doing with Black Unicorn, it's really about interrogating museums, monuments, archives, and what is deemed valuable enough to be remembered. Typically, we think of an archive as something that has enduring value. And so someone makes decisions about what has enduring value. And those people have particular biases or perspectives or life experiences. And often for people of a global majority, for Black and Brown people, for queer and trans people, and folks living at various, people with disabilities, people living at various intersections of identity, we are often marginalized from that narrative as not being worthy of being remembered, worthy of being held, worthy of being uplifted in those ways. And so you can see, like you were sharing with the tax dollars and the ways that our public dollars are spent, certain values assigned to uplifting certain cultural perspectives. And so, I think one of the things that is important is to remember to demystify monuments, demystify museums and archives, deconstruct what they actually are supporting, which is a cultural perspective of white supremacy, a cultural norm. And so, I see monuments when we see, I think of the monument of someone, for example, of communities, for example, if someone passes and we see, teddy bears and candles and letters to the, to that family or to that loved one, that's a monument that we create. I think about the fact that, and I really appreciate what you shared about Ursula Rucker saying our communities are a monument. And also, I really think it's important for us as, as Black people, people of color, people of global majority, to think about, how there are so many ways that people are documentarians in our family, like, who's the photographer at your family reunion, who's remembering if your grandmother made quilts, like that's also a significant piece of work that's to be kept and can be held as a monument as well, and I like this, statement of power or purpose, because I think that in all of the ways that Black and Brown people express in, whether it's in graffiti, public art, murals, being in a place and having a cipher, being in a, like, that is how we do our creative memory and cultural work. And it's up to us also to take away who gets to define what a monument is. Because too often we've been allowing, folks to say, okay, this is what is valuable, this is what should be remembered. But, we feel like it's extremely important for us to remember that our stories are as valuable and necessary to be remembered. And the ways that we do it are also valid. So I think there's like a myopic way that we could see monuments and archives, and then it's up for us to know, like, in our cultural practices, we do it in so many different ways as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue on what Bekezela was saying, where it was like, if somebody pours one out, that's a monument. If those the quilts are an abstract form that you can communicate with communities over distance. You have this person's army uniform, you have this person's like baby blanket, and you put it into an abstract language, but it's a way of communicating over distance, sort of like star maps, and celestial navigation. The other thing is, who decide what are we making monuments to? So one of the exercises I had in my class was, tell me about a monument you would want to see that you don't see, or where's the monuments to childbirth? Where's the monuments to like literacy? Where's the monuments to like, health? The majority of our monuments are not actually, I don't feel like they describe my values and the things that I find important. But I don't think and you can extrapolate that to the community or even to the American ideals. So there's a disconnect even between, what they say and what they do. So if you say these are your ideals, why then are all of the monuments to warfare? if it's about inclusion, you know, the American rhetoric is about inclusion, about multiply, all these other things, then you don't even line up along your own designations. And so that's something that is a foundation in the class of like, okay, we can start with the basis of seeing, you know, making space to remember those things that we want to see and that we do see. I often think before even we get to a place of a utopian place, there's a very concrete disconnect between, you know, like just walking like you talk it, you know, like there's there's already this big gap. So why not address that fundamentally before pushing on? And then the last thing is maintenance. Um, there's these narratives of white supremacy require literal maintenance, like dollars and cents, people to go out and, you know, whether it's military ads during sporting events, whether it's like cleaning monuments, whether it's cleaning graffiti off, like there's a physical and political constant maintenance to hold these things that we then say are ubiquitous and everybody wants. And I think even just like acknowledging that and seeing that starts to erode that the, you know, the wizard's, you know, the wizard's costume.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so as a historian, I know there are kind of subsets of us who are thinking about archives in a different way, trying to make clear that archives are a very specific type of group of documents that are meant to represent not the entire population, a specific portion of the population. And so I've looked at people like Lonnie Bunch, who was the previous director of the National Museum of the African American History and Culture in DC, who's kind of made waves in trying to bring more African American objects into the museum, trying to kind of motivate and encourage African Americans to think of their families as people who have important history. But I think you've all really made great points about also kind of diversifying the way we think about history and monuments and kind of the importance of everyday things that people of color, people of the majority, global majority do and have and think about. So if monuments are, you know, speaking to us, speaking to our future, if it's a conversation, does it make sense to remove them when we feel they no longer speak to our values, or if they ever spoke to our values? And so that kind of gets into a question I want to ask you all about this kind of movement that we've seen really picking up during the pandemic, but that's existed for a long time, to remove monuments, sometimes, you know, kind of violently toppling them, beheading them, thinking about replacing them. You know, is this kind of the way you think of social justice, or like, are there other ways that you think we can change the narrative with monuments?
So I think all of it. I think it's, you know, honestly, I think the toppling and the violence that is placed on these symbols is a reflection of the violence that has been enacted either directly by these persons or by these value structures and these power structures. But I think that alone is not just it. I think I want to see, and I'm kind of honestly, I'm much more interested in what is the other possibilities. Give room for all of these other possibilities, whether it's a space for dance and temporal, whether it's you know, monuments. I think it was in London where they had a pedestal. Don't quote me on it. I think it was like Piccadilly Circus where they had a pedestal and artists would rotate through, so it would, you know. I think that's the idea that this can only be here for a certain amount of time. I think murals, there's so many different ways. It's like you have all the colors and why you just using one? Like it just doesn't even make sense. And so I think what's happening is kind of an inevitability. But I think there are so many ways for us to move forward. And I'm excited about all of those things. I've just named like a baby few.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Stephen Foster Memorial statue that was removed in Oakland, which is in Pittsburgh, which is kind of at a junction between some universities as well as museums and libraries. And it was just kind of sitting right there. And it was a monument that a friend of mine who went to Carnegie Mellon University, she said that she would get so angry when she saw it because it was Stephen Foster kind of sitting on this great grand chair and a African-American man who's kind of this fictionalized character, but like in tattered and rags. And the story goes that it was someone that helped inspire him write his kind of minstrel music. But anyway, so this monument was removed, and then in its place was going to be a monument to African-American women with connections to Pittsburgh. So the city put representations of these women and asked people to vote. Those, of course, were vandalized and damaged. And the plan to actually put that monument for African-American women connected to Pittsburgh is kind of faltering, doesn't really exist anymore, because someone said, well, do you want to put up a monument to Black women and put up a monument to Black women? Or do you want to celebrate Black women? Like, which thing you want to do? Like, you want to put up a statue or do you want to do something? What is the point? And so because they didn't really want to do anything of that valuable that was concrete, besides maybe a concrete statue, nothing came from it. So I do think there's something about removing monuments and things like that is one thing, but like what's the point and what are you going to do about that space? And I'm a huge advocate of maybe just leaving it, having green space. I think green space is also it's monumental. We need more of it. And other versions of memory, of monuments, of moments, of time and place and space. So that, it's like creating the Juneteenth federal holiday. Like, what are you doing? Like, what are we talking about here? What are we really doing here? And so much America, the Hollywood, look, we did something takes over. And so that's the part that I have a problem with. Whether it's removing something, replacing something, or making anything, what is it that you want to do? What is it that you want to achieve? And maybe a monument isn't the right thing to do. Either removing it, replacing it, or making something else. But be intentional and be thoughtful about it.
I think what you're saying is that the process matters just as much, or perhaps in some cases more, than whatever the outcome is. I think that there are a lot of, for instance, universities in particular that are really interested in kind of taking down their monuments or like their statues and renaming their buildings and streets, right, to like eugenicists or whatever. Not whatever, excuse me, but it's something that they say that they're interested in doing. But I think that there needs to be a bigger investment and more in conversations around, okay, well, what are the conversations? Will we sort of like make a critical race, unit required for all of our students? All of these things that take political will, right? And as I said at the end of my 5-minute thing, taking down a monument and building a new one, it costs far less than actually like hiring faculty of color, or like, what I mean, creating programs to increase sort of their student body to be more reflective of the broader, the residents of this country, and so on and so forth. So I think process is really key within these conversations. And I had something else, but I forget it now. Process matters a lot.
Thank you for sharing that. I think what it makes me think about is cultural equity and how really, the monuments that are already in existence, whether they're to war heroes or to figures who, like Stephen Foster or Columbus, these are particular people who represent a certain white supremacist cultural values. And the ask and the demand and the work is, okay, so we do want these things to be, we want to dismantle white supremacy and genocidal practices. And so part of that is removing the reminders of those people and also the work of transforming our society so that cultural equity actually exists. So we can see, as you said, instead of choosing one color, we can have, the fullness of who has contributed to society, who has shaped, so it's not just about erecting like another monument, but how do you actually treat Black women in Pittsburgh? Because you can have a statue to Black women in Pittsburgh, but we could still have like the lowest, we could still have a poor quality of life. We could still have the least income, we could still have all these things. It's like with the statue, also equity, also liberation, also building, towards a transformative culture. And I think that's what I'm hopeful for in terms of us as artists and community members and people working together, is that we don't just want these like symbols and figureheads. We want the actual change in how we are and relate to one another. And so I think that is what I have in mind as like a future, is that, when we build that future, if we have images of ourselves, or, Erica talks about like a building being named after, if it's named after anyone that we love and care for who has contributed, it's like, don't insult the name of Harriet Tubman if we're not going to free us for real, for real. You know what I mean? Like, don't do that if you're not going to do it for real. And so that's what I would say in regards to that, because I'm like, maybe there needs to be a graveyard or some space where those things are held for, so we can remember that this was a part of our history and a part of our legacy. And it's like a yes and, to build upon. Because I believe that when we see things in our community, they give us a sense of, they give us information, and they do tell us, like you said earlier, Tereneh, that, people like you, ideas that you may have, concepts that, values that we share are held with a certain amount of appreciation in this place, or not, and so I think that does matter to our well-being, and our quality of life. And it's something we've done throughout time as human beings. So it's like part of what we do, and it's hopefully we could transform our practice with each other as well.
Yeah, and I think even if it's art, even as an artist, even if it's art, it's not art, and therefore it cannot be touched or be critiqued or like sometimes people like, but it's art. Well, the art and the artists have been complicit in white supremacy and violence and erasure of whole cultures and continents and people. Then no, we don't need that. We really don't need that. We really don't.
Something you brought up that I thought was sort of jumped out to me is this idea of what about so in a community, there's an appreciation, right? Let's say an appreciation for a figure. The city may not fund that, but that, it shows up in murals, say. That appreciation shows up in murals. It shows up in the functionality of space. So certain parks you don't call by the Parks and Recs label. You call by somebody else's name because this state park. And so what do you think so you brought up your conversation made me think about how there's a suppression of those commemorations that are happening. And there's also a denial of it being on a more public stage. But do you see that in different communities? And do you think there's the internet adds to any of that, being able to commemorate, kind of like shorthand would be like a DIY commemoration that you see happening on the internet in language, in ritual. I'd be interested in people's thoughts about how that bumps up against the lack of federal funding for something like a Harriet Tubman memorial or like a holiday.
I'll make sure I understand you're saying, do we see like just like a bumping up against that in communities versus like what's funded and so on?
Yeah, like we were talking about how we can all memorialize through ritual, through some of the things like languages or even architecture, like the architecture we make, the temporary architecture. Do you see that? Do you see the internet helping with that, or are there any spaces you see that happening to sort of counteract this constant denial of funding? And I think in New York, at least, the mayor's commission's report on monuments, that was one of the recommendations, is that going to the communities and sort of activating these things that are already, these mural projects, these things that are already in existence, as opposed to seeing it as a separate arm that needed to be activated and funded in order to bring these voices to the fore.
I am going to attempt to answer that question with something that I've observed. I have a friend, a dear friend and colleague, Leslie Jones, who's a professor at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. I think she's in the sociology department, and her research is basically on the latest wave of feminism, which is another Black feminist movement that's taking place sort of digitally. So Black Lives Matter is a Black feminist movement that is made possible through things like Twitter, social media, and so on and so forth, right? So it's a way of creating visibility within the structures and technologies that we have. And so in one sense, I think, I don't know that this answers your question directly, Kambui, but I think in terms of kind of offering a new kind of visibility, it does afford that. At the same time, if you know about TikTok, which I love watching, and the strike that Black creators were participating in over the last month because of the way in which the algorithms, which are birthed from these structures that we are in, right, of that privileged whiteness, essentially, aren't paying or crediting the labor of Black creators, right? So I think that like the technologies themselves are also like deeply racist, right? So I think this is not my area of specialty, but it's something I like reading about and I like listening to others talk about. But the question that you asked, Kambui, in terms of like these new technologies and modes of remembering and recognition, I think recognition is really what this whole conversation comes down to in a sense. That tension for me, I think is interesting. It's like a new era of old things, right? Like space is a new era of old things, space colonization rather. And I think the internet and what you were talking about is a new era of us kind of fighting and resisting and confronting these old structures that we're deeply embedded in.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. As you were sharing, it made me think of my friend Daryl Kinsel, who is an artist in Pittsburgh as well. He has hashtags are the new protest signs, and that's something that he's worked on for many years, but also it sort of came on the heels of Black Lives Matter. And I think like you could see the democratic access that Twitter and other platforms were offering to people who don't have larger platforms. So I totally think that the internet does offer space for creating new forms of monuments and memorializing and also challenging other systems of power. And I wanted to say that, there are things like just hashtag cite Black women, for example, like it is these ways, it's like going back to like old school librarian metadata and like pulling out that note and saying, okay, this is what we can use to to track our contributions and to note it and to make sure that it's, you know, solidified at least somewhere in the digital space. It's like one way of having some power. And like that culture strike that those TikTokers did was super important, right? Because it demonstrates the impact that Black cultural makers have, cultural workers have on a large scale. And I think that people who are really adept at using those digital platforms do create like significant impact around the world in terms of the ways that they may either share their art, build and share conversation. And I think it's an important tool that's available to us right now. But I definitely, I feel that, you know, Instagram, people are archiving all the time and don't know it. Or maybe they don't say it, or or maybe they do, right? But like, we're always creating a record. We're always creating a record of value, that something to ourselves, whether we extend that, you know, to each other or to larger communities. But we're often creating archives and documents, and and in terms of monuments, you know, I believe similarly to archives is that, because essentially they're the same things, just maybe like a different form. But I think that I do feel that I see a lot of people online creating spaces for new values to be lifted up. And Tumblr was a really great example of that. Not to like just take it to somewhere completely else, but like Tumblr was a great place for exchanges of ideas, for challenging societal norms. And that was, you know, one way that people were like challenging things, learning, and redistributing ideas and resources. But yeah, I feel like that does happen. And I think that there are many really wonderful examples of that happening. And a lot of people are creating their own like memory projects, you know, who would not have traditional access to, you know, a museum platform or funding for a monument, but they're saying, you know, our existence matters and we're here and we're contributing to the creation of culture and society in significant ways.
I really hate to stop anyone because I just love listening to you all, but I do have to. But I think everything that you all have said really kind of gets at, you know, when we have events like this, especially with panelists who are people of color, there's often kind of a question from someone like, well, you know, tell us kind of the one thing that we need to do, or like, how do we fix this? And you've all kind of spoken to the fact that there is no one thing that we need to do. It's very community specific. It's very, what are the needs of your community members and who are the people who are important to that community? And so I just want to thank you all so much for sharing your ideas and thoughts. And I really feel that you've likely spoken to the people who've attended. So thank you to you. Thank you to all of you for attending. And I think I will close it out unless Jose is going to come on and say something else.
Hi, no, thank you everyone. That was really wonderful. And this talk is being recorded and it'll be available on our website, warhol.org, as well as our YouTube page. And I want to thank all of you for participating. It was so meaningful and I learned so much. And as I mentioned earlier, I would love to get together in person when as the world improves. But for those of you watching at home, thank you for joining us for Art in Context, and hopefully you can join us for a future event as well. All right, thank you everyone.